to let you know that there are a couple of program changes. Firstly, Jerome will be talking third, so after Niels and Becerra. And our TPA is no longer, so we have that flexibility there. So up first, we'd like to call on Prof. Niels Goldschmidt from University of Siegen. Thank you.
All right, so thank you. So, dear colleagues, this talk will take place due to an accident. Why is that? I'm one of the lucky people who have already been able to participate in the first Mittermeier Symposium. It happened like this. A few years ago, there was a conference here in Johannesburg on Ludwig Lachmann, which I attended. Then, when Michael was preparing the first Mittermeier Symposium, he remembered that someone with gold in his name or in his institution had given an exciting lecture then. He thought that was me and invited me to the first Mittermeier Symposium. Later he realized he actually meant someone else, an accident. So I was able to cheat my way into the first conference and speak to you now as a subsequent error, so to say. Whether now something can be right the second time, which was objectively wrong the first time, I leave to the philosophers in the room to judge. Okay. And now for something completely different, to quote Monty Python once again in this conference. My lecture and my talk today focuses on the work of Karl Mittermeier and his role in commenting on liberal thought and economic and social theory. Mittermeier's work, The Hand Behind the Invisible Hand, which, as you all know, was accepted as his dissertation in 1986 and which was just recently published, followed the analytic philosophy of economics, which was originally considered in the 1970s for his doctoral degree. My remarks today are focused on these writings, and I want to suggest that in spite of the completion of his project 36 years ago, Mittermeier can actually be seen as a forerunner to intellectual controversies that are quite topical today. The central thesis of Mittermeier's work, in my opinion, his work, The Hand Behind the Invisible Hand, is that there is a tension between pragmatic and dogmatic perspective on economic liberalism overall and the market order in particular. Tracing the intellectual development of liberalism in broad strokes since Adam Smith, he views the pragmatic-dogmatic binary as a form of a categorization through which we might distinguish different views and justification for free markets and quotation marks. This distinction does not suggest that one side, dogmatics, purport the features of the liberal creed must simply and necessarily be taken on faith, while the other, the pragmatists, are solely concerned with the viable application of principles in the world as we inhabit it. Neither approach can be reduced to such simplified descriptions. But it does suggest that there are differences in the genesis of liberal perspectives on markets. Mittermeier identifies a mantra among those he calls dogmatists as broadly adhering to the perspective that one only need to, quotation, keep the government out of economic affairs and all else will fall into place of its own accord without the deliberate efforts of anyone, quotation ends. To pragmatists, on the other hand, Mittermeier ascribes the view that, quotation, it may not be at all obvious that market order would then come about automatically in the absence of governmental interference, quotation ends. That Mittermeier felt solidarity with and endorsed the intellectual views of this latter group will not come to a surprise to this audience. While this question and other related questions did not originate with Mittermeier, he was indeed ahead of his time in grasping some of these tensions inherent to liberalism. I wish to make 3 short points in my presentation. First, that there is much common ground between Mittermeier's pragmatism and the Ordnungsökonomik, order liberalism, of Walter Eugen, the famous Freiburg economist who was the intellectual forerunner for the social market economy in Germany. Second, that in interpreting Hayekian liberalism, Mittermeier provided insights more than 30 years ago that are just now being discovered again. And third, that Mittermeier's works also serve as a starting point for contemporary research in what I call contextual economics. First, it is somewhat ironic because whereas followers of the German ordoliberalism have recently been accused of dogmatism in their insistence on particular economic principles, so Andreas mentioned it earlier this day, especially as concerns policy of austerity within the European Union, Mittermeier actually refers to Eugen, to Walter Eugen, one of the school's founders, as a free market pragmatist. Yet Mittermeier understood Eugen's thought remarkably well, so in my opinion, and I did some research on Walter Eugen, justifiably drawing on and interpreting his work in line with the position he supports and identifies as pragmatic. This is also more surprising because Eugen himself is often regarded as inflexibly rigid in his perspectives on political economy. So some of you might know that in Eugen's work there's a lot about constitutive and regulative principles in his posthum published work, Grundsätze der Wirtschaftspolitik. So they have these principles in it. And there's often a misinterpretation that these principles are rigid. So if you really look very intensive on that, you will see that these principles are not principles as we understood it normally, but it will be a different story and more stuff for the history of economic thought. Yet, Mittermeier is full of praise for Eugen, so I'm happy about this because I'm an Eugen guy too. So Eugen's insistence that the economic system is not self-regulating implied that the dogmatic approach, to use Mittermeier's terminology, was not sufficient. Eugen notes, quotation, "The fact that the price system in the laissez-faire period was not in perfect running order does not mean that the price system is quite incapable of governing the economic process. What experience of laissez-faire goes to prove is that the economic system cannot be left to organize itself. So there is no question of any return to laissez-faire." So that's Eugen's position, no return to laissez-faire, but the problem of laissez-faire was not that there is a price system, but it was not governed by a sort of an order. And when we replace Eugen's use of the term laissez-faire with Mittermeier's use of the term dogmatism, we quickly come to see the shared spirit between the two thinkers. Indeed, Mittermeier's perspective corresponds quite closely to Eugen's view, as he writes, so quotation Mittermeier, that the market economy is an artifice which has to be promoted deliberately is a pragmatic standpoint supported throughout this study. So, yeah, he's an Eugen-man, Mittermeier, in a way, perhaps, so that's my opinion. In contrast to the dogmatic or laissez-faire approach proclaimed by Mittermeier and Eugen, respectively, the state does take on an active role. Mittermeier correctly identifies the importance that economic power took on for Eugen as well as the role of the state to develop a functioning, humane societal order. This does not exist on its own, it must be created and maintained. So the economic system is something which must be created and maintained. Competition is a task. So it's not something natural, but it's a task and it must be maintained by order. In this sense, both ordoliberalism as well as the concept of the social market economy strives for an order of the community, the goal of which is to provide everyone with equal opportunities beyond class barriers. So this reminds me a little bit was Pascal was talking this morning about Valras. So you need, as a starting point, a way how you can deal with equal opportunities when you're going to establish a functioning market economy. In this sense, you all know him, Ludwig Erhard, so the first Minister of Economic Affairs in Germany. So Ludwig Erhard's prosperity through competition, so Wohlstand für alle, is not only be understood as a mere consumerism, so it's not only about prosperity, but rather a project of political distribution that should enable, the first thing, people to partake in the economic and societal accomplishments of the modern age. So the starting point, the idea of ordoliberalism as well as the social market economies, is that you enable people first so that they could take place in a market economy, so that they can bring in their efforts and their ideas and their creativity. So that is the idea, that you need some sort of order that makes this could enable. In his idea of an irenic formula, derived from the Greek expression eirene, peace, Alfred Müller-Amack, who coined the term of the social market economy exactly 75 years ago, also demands the reconciliation of economic efficiency. So Amos talked a little bit about economic efficiency, or there is perhaps no economic efficiency, but they were convinced there must be something like a reconciliation about economic efficiency and the social will, which at the same time has to be based on a reconciliation of divergent moral claims prevalent in a society. So the idea is not only that there must be something like an open society or an inclusive society, which gives the people the chance to be part of this society and the economic system, but also we have to accept that there are different convictions within a society, and it's not the aim of a society to have a consensus on all issues, but that you have good compromises. That is the meaning of the irenic formula of the social market economy, the idea of reconciliation. So you need some sort of reconciliation. You can tell it in modern terms like social cohesion. You need some social cohesion for good economic performance. We need a sort of economic performance for social cohesion. So that is the whole idea, in my opinion, of the social market economy and the idea of the ordoliberalism, that you bring, that you bound together these both ideas. So in order to achieve this goal, the concept must be open for further developments and therefore pragmatic. So if you read Alfred Müller-Amack, for example, so he always says the social market economy is an evolving concept. So if the circumstances change, you have to change the social market economy. So as I said, it's not about strict principles, but there are some benchmarks, but you have to evolve the economic order when the circumstances are altering. I believe strongly that this is linked to what I wish to call the economics of reconciliation. So some sort of research which I just started on, the economics of reconciliation. If, as economics, we take seriously that the economy is an integral part of society, and I think that's obvious, and that is not merely a subsystem which is distinct from broader society and can be analyzed independently of broader society, that has implication for economics potential. Contained within it, there is an alternative approach, even a diametrically opposed view, to the famously invoked alienation thesis of markets. Market society has the potential to reconcile divergent claims in society. It has the potential to contribute to a peacemaking agenda within societies. Again, this implies, of course, that we don't equate market society with a laissez-faire order, but rather that we emphasize that the manifold ways in which economic policy has the potential to address questions of societal participation and issues relating to identity and fostering these. Perhaps this is even more pronounced in settings, and the promise of reconciliation is greater in contexts in which entire segments of society have been disenfranchised historically. Perhaps, but I'm not an expert on this, this is particularly pertinent for the case of South Africa. So I think there might be a potential of these ideas of the economics of reconciliation, which could be linked back to the social market economy on the one hand, but as well on the pragmatic view of Mittermeier and his ideas on economic order. Second, a brief remark on Mittermeier's understanding of Hayek. Mittermeier's reading of Hayek must be conceived as one of the curiosities, albeit an interesting and ultimately rewarding one, of the book The Hand Behind the Invisible Hand. Trying to locate Hayek on the pragmatism-dogmatism spectrum, Mittermeier seems to conclude that Hayek's late works about the role of cultural evolution and the transmission of norms and mores, in particular, display large degrees of free market dogmatism. Indeed, when Hayek emphasized the advantageousness of cultural transmitted rules and institutions, many scientists raised the critique that he had committed a naturalistic fallacy. So we can discuss it, but yeah, there is something in that there is some sort of a naturalistic fallacy in Hayek. Especially at the end of the 1990s and in the early 2000s, this was discussed in great detail. Mittermeier's analysis of the Hayekian account of cultural evolution might certainly be correct. We would, however, not note that his repudiation of Hayek as a potential pragmatist is somewhat overblown, in my opinion. Apart from reference to Hayek's more pragmatic-like works, a comparison between Eugen's and Hayek's views might also help to clarify this issue further. As I have shown elsewhere, the two authors were extremely close, not only as friends and colleagues, but also in their suggestion for an economic policy. When Mittermeier traces out certain dogmatic elements in Hayek vis-à-vis the thoroughly pragmatic Eugen, we must not forget that he is thereby addressing nuances between two variants of liberalism, which, at the time, this is important, at the time, could only be rudimentarily distinguished from one another, with the only significant difference with respect to economic policy being the question of the state's role in preventing, destroying, or regulating monopolies and cartels. The question of the economic order and the state's responsibility in bringing about the conditions under which economic activity can take place is certainly another difference, though it is not one that was especially pronounced during Eugen's lifetime. Moreover, it should not be forgotten that both Mittermeier and Hayek fundamentally share a vision of order and of rejecting a mechanistic, so yeah, it was quoted already by Bill, a mechanistic understanding of the economy, which becomes abundantly clear in Mittermeier's criticism in the analytical philosophy of economics, in which the economist is a mere observer. Only one sentence on Mittermeier's interpretation of Buchanan. Immediately following the passages on Eugen in his dissertation, Mittermeier references Buchanan, so Alan will better know than me, noting that the public choice theory quotation should become more normative, not in the sense that it discusses ad hoc measures and states, but that it expresses opinion of process or procedure. It means on the rules of conduct in public administration. Quotation ends. Yet again, Mittermeier's discussion anticipates a controversy that has been carried out by Norman Berry, among others, between an end state and procedural liberalism, in other words, between means and ends. He also highlights the proximity between Eugen and Buchanan, which Buchanan himself discovers towards the end of his career and which was systematically examined by Victor van der. My final and my third point. I've just outlined the manner in which Mittermeier understood and interpreted Eugen correctly. But Mittermeier's genius is not captured as much by his conception of Eugen. Rather, he can be seen as a forerunner of what in Germany is called Neue Ordnungsökonomik, and what we refer to in English as contextual economics. It is particularly Mittermeier's focus on institutions and their importance for societal orders that makes him a pioneer in this field, so I'm really convinced about that. Contextual economics, so we discussed it already at lunch, contextual economics is concerned with the relationship between the economic sphere and the wider social system. In this sense, it is opposed to isolating economics, which concentrates on the processing operating exclusively within the economic system. So contextual economics is the opposite of an isolating economics, which only looks on the economic process, only on the narrow economic system, which only looks on the rules within the economic system. Especially in times of vast social, environmental, and ecological change, political realignments, financial crisis, increasing inequality, and ever faster methods of communication, processes of transformation are particularly observable and impactful. So my argument is that we're living in a time, and Alan argued in this way again and again on this conference, we're living in a time of changes, of rapid changes, and therefore it becomes more and more important that we're focusing on the context of the things which are happening around the economic system, and we examine very carefully what is the impact of these changes in the context for understanding economic processes and for the outcomes of the economic processes. So I think that having contextual economics is in a way an economics of transformation. So therefore I think we have to keep in mind these aspects of the context. That empirical investigation and theoretical approaches must be equipped to take into account these changes lies at the heart of the research focus of contextual economics, as I just tried to explain. It should thus also be no surprise that interest in contextual economics arose with the disintegration of the Soviet Union and the end of socialism and cognizance of the failure of the transplantation of Anglo-Saxon and continental European concepts of market economies to other societies. Contextual economics thus takes societal embeddedness seriously, typically taking on an institutionalist bent. It is precisely here that Mittermeier's insight proved persistent, especially when we consider economic transformation in Eastern Europe and Eurasia. Mittermeier's call that, quotation, knowledge of institution may at least enable us to gain a reasonable understanding of what economic order there may be in various parts of the world is important. Quotation ends 2 words before. Moreover, returning to his discussions of pragmatic versus dogmatic perspectives on free markets and the state of theory in economics, we should be reminded that when an understanding of institution is required to grasp particular social phenomena, disregarding their impact only leads to faulty understandings of the challenges at hand. Mittermeier warns against exactly this type of taking institution for granted, arguing forcefully in the hand behind the invisible hand. Quotation, that's the number one. It is as though market relations are inherent in nature, as though natural laws governs mutual impingement, or as though spontaneous evolution, if allowed to run its course, may always be counted onto creative those unique economic relations among individuals which constitute the natural market order. A theory which takes the existence of the market mechanism for granted can hardly be a guide of promoting market order. I think that's a really thrilling sentence. A theory which takes the existence of the market mechanism for granted can hardly be a guide of promoting market order. So if you want to talk about market orders, we need a theory about the context, or we have to at least to take serious on discussing on the context. We detect similar sentiments even earlier in the analytical philosophy of economics, where he highlights not only the importance of institutions in the beginning of the book, in chapter 2 especially, but in which he calls implicitly for a broad societal approach to studying economic phenomena. He is skeptical of narrow understandings of economics, noting that, quotation, a single discipline which does justice both to the logic of economic relations and to empirical accounts of the institutional framework remained an elusive ideal. So in a way that reminds me, and we discussed it also, let's call it the lunch, so on Pareto, so that you have to go a step further. If you want to understand the whole scene, you have to go into sociology, you have to go in different disciplines to understand better the context and the interplay between economy and society. And Mittermeier goes further, and his interest is ultimately in a quotation integration of theory and institutional fact. It is about developing a theoretical approach, but doing so in a way that examines institution in contextual ways. I conclude. Particularly, the third point marks the genius of Karl Mittermeier. That he, for me, so he's a genius in a manifold way, but for me, that's because I'm doing contextual research, and always when I find someone who supports my position, so he must be a genius. That he had come to realize, Mittermeier, what is just now being acknowledged within the contextual economics field, and that he had come to these insights before the period of increased transformation of the 1990s and the 2000s, which led to the growth on the subfield, makes Mittermeier a forerunner of a highly relevant contemporary area of research. Allow me to finish by citing from the introduction of Mittermeier's dissertation, in which he combines facets of alte, old, and neue, new Ordnungsökonomik or liberalism. Discussing both the role of the state in the free market and the contingent nature of societal arrangements, he states the following, quotation, "There are certain arrangements of society, perhaps an indefinite number of possible ones, under which markets flourish. Because such an arrangement of society constrains individuals, it can take the place of the very visible hand of an authority with discretionary powers and constitute an invisible hand by which man and woman are led to promote the general well-being, so it was no part of their intentions to do so." So on the one hand, I think there's a very, very important insight in the beginning, that they say there are certain arrangements of society, perhaps an indefinite number of arrangements under which markets could flourish. So if you remind on the works of Arthur and Robinson, or even on Northwood and Weinglass, there's always the argumentation of doorstep condition and all these things which are inevitable for a market. So I think Mittermeier is right. There are a lot of different possibilities how societies could be arranged and combined with markets and a market's order. And on the other hand, he makes clear that the market order itself is perhaps an outcome of the interrelation between individuals, but not necessarily an outcome of their intention in the way they interact in regard to this market order. So not only is this allusion to Adam Smith particularly on the point and timely in its criticism of an anarcho-libertarian thought that is willing to jettison the constructive formative power of the state. It also rephrases Smith's message, offering a combination of his acknowledgement with contemporary research that highlights societal embeddedness as vitally important in social affairs. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Niels. Can we take some questions from the floor? Would you like to go first, Amos?
Thank you. Thanks for the presentation. It's very interesting. But I'm slightly sort of, I wouldn't say puzzled, but it's a strange thing for me. You know, you're talking with excitement, duly so, of course, about contextual economics, and to me, it's just political economy. So what actually happened, and that's actually the sales story, is that what you're describing as contextual economic has been political economy. All the classical economists wrote about economics within the context of politics and sociology. And the issue was, how does this context affect economic analysis? And that went all the way to Walras. Even Walras, in his weird way, thought like this. Then we landed with economics, which was perhaps this idea that everything can be explained within economics. And the worst thing was the re-emergence of political economy, which is the equivalent of economics imperialism. Namely, now you explain everything using economic analysis. But so contextual economics is actually a revival of real political economy. But then there is a big question, pertaining also to Pareto. when you do contextual economics, do you revise your economic analysis? Or do you, a la Pareto, say, there is an economic analysis, but there are things around it we have to think about, and we can think about the relationship, but the economic analysis stays as it is? That is the question.
Of course, a very good question. Perhaps first of all, you're quite right. So contextual economics is nothing new. It's political economy in a way. So
The old political economy.
The old political economy, and in a way, it's always an economics of transformation. So if you think about Adam Smith, it was the political economy of industrialization. Gustav Schmoller was the economics of industrialization in Germany, and so on and so on. So always, if you realize that there's something going on in the context in society, you have to change your economic understanding as well. That is the advantage of any form of political economy. So in this way. So as you already mentioned, so I did some research on Schmoller in the last years. So Schmoller always said so it was one of the many thoughts, but to rename political economy to economics, so Volkswirtschaftslehre to Ökonomik or something like that. So and there you're absolutely right. On the other hand, so what was again the question?
No, the question. But Schmoller, I think, is slightly different because he would think that everything is related in the sense that you cannot separate. I'm not necessarily saying you can't separate, but there's a big difference by saying yes, there is economics, but there is underlying other factors that influence the economic analysis. So it's not necessarily because you can't have economics as a separate discipline, but the question is, how do the other disciplines affect economic analysis?
So first of all, but we can't do Schmoller exegesis now, but I would not agree that everything is connected with everything.
Well,
so Schmoller is much more clear what he's doing than always stated, but that's a different story. But so I think what is different nowadays, and we just yesterday talked a little bit about that when we talked about ante and post facts, that nowadays we have to realize that the economy is in a way a system. So in the Luhmannian sense, so, and therefore there is something like a specific economic sense, like some systematically thing which going on. So the role prices plays, it has something like a systematic, and now that we have to acknowledge that there is something like an economic system, but by alteration in the context, the system is challenged, and I think how the system is challenged could not be solved by looking on the economic system alone, but we have to understand what's going on as a sociology, in the sociology, and so on and so on. So it's more close to Walras and to Pareto, in my opinion.
Thank you. I think Melissa was next.
Sure. Yeah, thank you very much. That was very instructive. I am wondering how these two things, so the idea of analyzing the system as a mechanism, why is that in opposition to this idea of a contextual economics, if I understood correctly? Right, so this is something that you discarded, or that Mittermeier would discard, and this mechanistic view. And I'm wondering why those things are in opposition, why having a view of contextual economics would prevent you from analyzing this in a mechanistic way?
I think, very good question. So it's related to what I'm just said. Yes. So in a way, we have systematically structures, understanding of economic system. I thought it's not a mechanistic system, so then it's really, as I said, in the Luhmannian sense, it's a system which evolves by itself, and it has its logic, but it's not mechanistic, so it's that everything is already determined in the beginning, but the system in Luhmannian sense is something which evolves slowly. We discussed it yesterday, that it's a slow process, so it's a slow-moving fact within the system. But the problem is that when the context altered rapidly, you have to understand how the interplay is between the economic system and the context, and therefore I think it's necessary that you have to understand the context, and that the context has relevance is due to the fact that the economic system is not a mechanistic one, so a determined system, but someone which evolves slowly but by its own logic. So therefore you have to find out where are some interfaces that we talked today between the development of the economic system and the institution, how they affect the economic system, the evolving of new institution, and how the imposing of new formal institution can affect the economic system. And so I think it's not that far away from a mechanistic view, but in a way it's something totally different. So it's same but different, to put it in that way, because if you understand that the economic system is evolving itself and different to Luhmann, it has an intersection with the context, then we can understand better what's going on. But yeah, so there is something stored, so in a way, of mechanistic thinking, but I think we have to overcome that as a determined understanding of economic processes. Was it? No? Okay.
Yeah. Can I put a question? I hope I put it correctly. We think of the economy as a sort of module, if you like, and then have this thing around it, and it's a thing around it that means that we have to keep rethinking what's happening within the module. But even that is, I think, being challenged by the speed with which things are happening now, so that you could think of us as being something situated within an overall framework. But unfortunately, the framework now seems to change even more rapidly than the economy itself. So that's my first question is, to what extent does the context become faster and even more complicated than the thing that we're examining within it? And then my second question is, all the time we have references to market power, or does the market system work here? Is it efficient? The price system? But all of those depend on understanding how markets actually work. And I have the feeling that most of the people who speak about markets never went on markets, never looked at the fact that market rules are different, and that the notion of market is still something abstract, and it shouldn't be. We should be down on the ground looking at how markets work. And that's a problem with excuse to Pascal, with both Walras and Pareto in some sense. They didn't actually spend a lot of time looking at specific markets. And so those are my two questions, okay? Yeah. One is the speed at which the environment's changing, and the other is, what is our notion of a market? When we talk about a market system, it's always, and then we say, well, that's something we know about, but we don't know about, I think.
So, up to your first question. So I think, first of all, it's important to realize that there are different so that the context and the economic system evolve in a different way, and with different Geschwindigkeit, speeds with different speed. And you have to keep in mind that there could be different speeds. So if you, for example, look on the financial markets in the 1990s, we had the problem that the economic system evolves with such a speed so that the institutional frameworks can't keep up with that. That was one of the problems which leads to the financial crisis in the way. Nowadays, we have the situation that the context is changing so rapidly. There has so much speed in it. So if you look on digitalization or what's going on with war against Ukraine, so that the economic system is too slow to adapt. So one of the problems and of the friction which has effect to the society and the individuals who are living in society is the difference of the speed of the context and the economic system. And if you look back in the history, I think, and that might be an answer to Arms as well, is that in the time between 1950s and the end of the 1980s, we had a time where the context and the economic process evolved with a similar speed. And therefore, it was easy to establish an economic theory which, in a way was static. And that is one of the problems. It's become predominant because the world was, in a way, so there was enough crisis, but in a way it was more stable, or the speed of both systems goes up in the same way. And what we learned at the end of the 1990s, that the world is a world of different speeds and of different alteration, and it's not easy to keep up both systems in a similar way. So that might be an answer to the first question. And the second point, you're totally right. So that is something we learned yesterday from Melissa, that necessarily we have to look more specific what's going on in specific markets. So there is not the market and the price, but there are not, so the market of digitalization is something totally different than the market of underwear. So obviously, and then you have to keep in mind the institution for these specific markets and the development in these markets, and definitely. So you're quite right, but the logic, coming back to your first question, it's the same. It's about different speeds in different spheres of economics and society, of economy and society.
Thanks.
Great, thank you very much. Our next speaker is Dr. Bassir Murada from Addis Ababa University.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank Mrs. Isabella and the organizer, Dr. Michael, for facilitating this opportunity for me to present my idea about critical realism and its promise for African development in the frontiers of global capitalism. So, my point is more of revolved around the ontological aspects most of the time, which is neglected in the discussion of economics or development. So, in the conduct of scientific research, the action of researchers are guided by their own systematic belief. This might be scientific or unscientific, and they generate and interpret knowledge claims about reality. So this system of belief or paradigm has its own defined ways in terms of three sets of questions involving the three important things, which are ontology, epistemology, and methodology. So ontology defines a research framework with while epistemology determines the research question that we need to answer. Together, ontology and epistemology, including with methodology, from an all-encompassing system of interrelated practice and thinking that defines the nature of research. So, most of the time, when we see development research, mainstream research in development has been conducted primarily under two philosophical paradigms, which are known as positivism and interpretivism. Positivism, in a sense, which is more focused on deductivism and falsification, justifiability, and other things are there. And interpretivism is trying to search meanings that are situated in a subjective manner. So the practice of economic development most of the time is informed by applied science. There is an applied term and their underlying philosophical paradigm, most of the time modernization, dependency, Marxism, and other things, and they have also their own specific assumptions. Statistical, economics, econometrics, modeling, others are very much dominant. So, due to this, the African development and development policy making is most of the time informed by this applied term or applied science, which is particularly impacted by the field of development and gave the right to supremacy of an applied development in microeconomics. So, for example, there is modernization, particularly when you come to Africa. Modernization is in some context equivalent with westernization. So most of the 1960s development policy implemented are more of a kind of emulation of the West based on their recommendation. So the appetite turned strengths from the 1980s onwards by increasing dominance of international financial institutions and donors in the shaping development of paradigm and policies. For example, if we see structural adjustment and other things, we can see kind of dominancy in terms of such kind of issues. Thus, a positivist paradigm that calls for objectivity and deductive reasoning towards logical conclusion has been the default philosophy in the practice of development, particularly in Africa. And the Western views and understanding of the African remain firmly rooted in the colonial scripted image of the African backwardness, primitivism, and rationality is a basis in describing the African underdevelopment. So it shall be argued that this leads to an impoverished understanding of development in Africa and only serves to keep African countries within the Western sphere of influence. So I believe that such kind of influence ignore the human values of freedom and emancipation that would be central to any valid conception of development in Africa. Therefore, I argue that Africa development paradigm has been inverted, defined, and through various empirical and colonial discourses. For example, Mudebe tried to raise about a question whether it is accurate or not, and he explained the colonialist agenda engaging in this enterprise that has today turned Africa into a dependent and unproductive continent. So, given this old situation, critical realism is an approach that merits attention from African philosophers, and a critical social science research is very important because it is provocative approach to establish school of thought in Western philosophy, has been controversial and has reached philosophical. So I try to use the Roy Bhaskar critical realism or adopt this one because the critique of positivism by developing a theory of philosophical discourse and ideology on the basis of the transcendental realism and critical naturalism. So in critical realism terms, mainstream economics does not possess an adequate ontological of Africa. So most of the time things are concentrated in terms of epistemological debate. So the ontological aspect in Africa, I believe that is not addressed because a lot of developmental policies were implemented, or we can say that prescribed, but still we are, for example, I think the independence from independence, which means 1960 up to now, we are still struggling to come out of the vicious circle of poverty. So this paper used the Bhaskar work, that is radical reformulation of foundational concept in philosophy. So in this paper, I try to outline the principal argument just for sake of one, to increase awareness amongst African social science researchers and to enrich a kind of or provocative a debate regarding Africa, instead of, in a sense, instead of engaging in unnecessary dialogue in the Western Afrocentric concept, we should come out of, or we should have to bring a kind of an alternative idea that can make Africa develop. So, towards a dialogue that engage constructively with the theory and practice of development. So, if this is the point, before we proceed to the other point, let me just first clarify what's critical realism and philosophy of science. As I said earlier, positivism is the dominant philosophical paradigm in social science in comparison to others, such as interpretivism, critical theory, and critical realism. So between these two extremes, there are several schools of thoughts emerged in the forms of heterodox or others, such as critical theory, social constructivism, and critical realism, each of them with different emphasis. So critical realism is often presented here as a meta-critic of positivism as an ideology. In fact, it is under-labored, but in the near future, I think it will come as an approach or a theory. So there are other theories that are classified as heterodox economics and are marginal to most of the time mainstream economics. I think in the yesterday discussion, we have been experiencing such kind of issues. So critical realism is by now a broad, internally consistent philosophical system that tries to attempt to transcend of various dualisms such as objective, subjective, positivism, interpretivism, division in philosophy of science that most physical and social science take for granted. So contemporary critical realists assume that the theories generated by conduct of scientific research must revolve around the independent reality, which means should have to give a reality that goes beyond the observable or testable or experienced one that comprise the world, even though humans are usually unable to fully understand or observe this reality, and that our knowledge of reality is always fallible. So Bhaskar agreed with this description of critical realism as, in fact, he is ontologically bold but cautious of epistemological aspects. So in his discussion, he tried to divide the natural world and social world. This one. So in his discussion, there are two things, intransitive and transitive. So he believed that the intransitive cannot be reduced at the sake of observable reality. So in terms of nature, he tried to say that it is more of experimental control, which means in essence there are closure. Then if there is a closure, we can predict. But when it comes to the social world, it is too different. We only explore because the society we are living is in open system. So what we are going to do is not predict, but explain an events or causality. So these are the points he tried to discuss in terms of these two things. So what are the controversies, assumptions, and theories about social world we investigate? So according to him, the social reality is stratified. In a sense, it is deep, open, and complex system. As we discussed earlier, we are living in a complex system where there are also independent realities. So realities are stratified. In a sense, we are not living in an ontologically flat, but we are living in a deep world. So there are levels of reality. Data, for example, he called them the empirical, the actual, and the real. So most of the time we are observing or testing or experiencing the first one, which is known as the empirical one, but the others are deep-rooted but still unexplored, but they do have their own influence in the empirical world. So stratified is not flat but deep. So there are three levels of reality. I will discuss them later. The other is open system. Social world is multi-determined, so we cannot accurately predict events but explain them. So most of the time, instead of predicting, I think we put scenario, then explain. So closure is not possible in the social world. The other is we are living in a complex system, so there are emergencies. So what the role of social science, I think, need to be is addressing these emergencies in the interplay between economics, development, and the human world. So we cannot rely on empirical data to answer a research question, because the world is more than that what we catch in the eye. So the world is much more than what we know at a given point in a time. So we have multiple causalities, and we do not know accurately these cores which counter the others. or which reinforce or which cancel over it. So we are living in multitude or multitude system. So there are different emergent issues there. So he tried to explain stratified reality in terms of this one. So so here I try to bring the tip of the iceberg as a good example for this explanation. So I think instead of focusing on the empirical one, I think better to focus on the real. As you see from the tip of the iceberg, most of the reality aspects are deep under the sea. So in a positivist tradition, what we are trying to observe is only what we see, but deep down there are a lot. For example, this in the underneath, it may state for million times or more than that, but we can't explain what makes this mass strong than the other. So such kind of metaphor is, I think, important. So empirical is the experience we can capture through our senses and perceptions, and there are also actual aspects in some contexts we can address, but still they are underneath. So the events that happen but are not necessarily observable. But when we come to the real one, they are generative mechanisms or causal powers that are responsible of the outcome that is observed. So most of the time in epistemological debate, we have been in some context forgetting to incorporate what is important in our discussion. So we cannot rely on empirical data to answer our question, because the world is more than that. What we observe, what we perceive, and what at a given point in time. So the empirical gives us an avenue to access the real, but only when the former is guided by theory. Here I'm not going to criticize the positivist tradition, but theories do have their own strengths and weakness. So most of the time, in fact, we are living in a changing world. So some theories might be incapable of, I think, understanding some issues, because there are a multitude of factors. So to access, but only when the former is guided by theory. So the goal of science is the identification of theories of things, entities, agents, and their causal power. So this is we cannot limit enclosure. There are multiple causalities that we are looking for. These multiple causes that are responsible for the event that we are investigating, and human beings are themselves, or we are in open system. So there are structures and generative structure which cause another events. So as you see from the slide, the world is in open system. So we cannot do a neat experiment in social science world, or in social world, because it is a causal network of interacting forces, counteracting and reinforcing each other. So we are in an open system, and we are capable of communication, creativity, resistance, but there is always the possibility of something new opening, and this, I think, is an evidence. So multiple causality instead of causal laws. Instead of A to A cause B, I think the better to see the world is there are multiple causalities. Human beings are themselves open system capable of communication, creativity, and resistance. Look this picture. This is a flock of birds. So I think emergence refers to the properties that arise when parts of a whole are organized in a particular way. So an emergent entity is constituted by these parts, how they are arranged in relation to one another, and the unique properties of whole holds due to the arrangement of the part. So we cannot deny such kind of factors. So the aim of the social science, I think, should be or need to discover these emergent properties. There are different entities, agents, structure, and their emergence, generative power or mechanism are the object of social science. Conceptually, mechanisms are nothing other than a way of acting of things. Mechanisms are inherent to physical and social structure, enabling or limiting what can happen within a given context. So, okay. Let's come to the Africa context. What the African scholarship has been doing regarding such kind of, it may be for refuting or in modifying or in changing such kind of issues. So philosophy and social scholarship is, in Africa is important when we discuss about such kind of issues. African philosophy is the name of an emergent and still developing fields of idea and idea space, intellectual endeavors, discourse and discursive network within and beyond academic philosophy. Huntuji, the Afro-Latino, try to define this philosophical aspect as a set of text, specifically the set of text written by African and described as philosophical by the authors themselves. In fact, I believe that there is no unified metaphysical existence. Truth is dispersed everywhere. So what our sometimes I think making rationality as a continental aspect is by itself is or has its own weakness. So various characterization has been given or suggested. New, for example, they call them as ethnophilosophy, excavationist, professional, and other things. So they tried their best to give a solution for such kind of understanding about Africa. So Afropolitanism emerged to dissenters or de-essentialize and valorize the continent, which means they want to detach rationality with continental aspect. So Africa, they try to say that Africa is a continent and not a philosophy or a system of value. So they try to search for African philosophy. They criticize the Afrocentrists as if they are searching for philosophy, and their idea is valuable from Eurocentric viewpoint because they reinforce the European stereotypes. Therefore, intellectual freedom presuppose and demythologize of the idea of Africa. So the Afro-Latinism, especially the Mudembe, Achille Mbembe, believe that intellectual freedom presuppose demythologizing of the idea of Africa. They believe that there should be a responsible subject, liberating the future by giving back the individual his or her rights and responsibility. So they believe that plurality is very important in their discussion. So currently, one size fits all, or the basket case cannot work in the frontiers of global capitalism because the Chinese are here in Africa. Most of the time, Africa becomes the battleground for these competing powers. And the West's moral authority to dictate economic and development policy was or has been eroded by the failure of, for example, structural adjustment in most part of the Africa, the East Asia crisis, even the recent COVID-19. We can also add the Russia-Ukraine war, which gives us a new perspective for development. So emerging global powers such as China, Russia, India, and Brazil signal a new multipolar world with more complicated international relations. So under this transitional condition, Africa scholars have the opportunity to seize the moment and reformulate or come up with a possible idea or understanding that meet African contemporary needs, which means instead of engaging in a categorical European African debate, I think what is important here in Africa is bringing an alternative idea or theoretical framework that can satisfy the need of their society. So, what are the implications of ontological depths? Especially, what is the implication of this critical realism for Africa? The first implication is philosophical implication. There is reality beyond experience, so we should have to acknowledge this one. So, we should have to search for this reality that goes beyond actual events. So, reality is not necessarily how it happens to us. Reality contains entities with causality power, even if they are not triggered by. So when conducting research, I think we need to consider these important issues. The other is practical implication, especially in terms of methodology. Research design, what methodology methods are used to collect the data need to be sufficient to address the level of the real. Because the Roy Bhaskar claimed that we should have to, I think, see different kinds of reality in order to sufficiently address the level of the real. So methodology, in a sense, multiple methodology, multiple engagement, multiple investigators and other are, he called it retroduction. So it's important to ask what is the nature of object of investigation, what is made of, what are the constituent of parts, what are the constituent of part and constituent of part. So you do not go look for something that does not exist, and so you do not ignore the full reality of the world. When I said ontological reality, we are not going too far, that is beyond our capacity, but it doesn't mean that we are going to ignore the reality of the world. So if you set off with a bad theory of ontology, you are really risking that you'll end up with enough project that ignore or mismatch the reality. So my conclusion is that critical realism for African audience, especially philosophers and social scientists concerned with social and economic development, sufficiently critical of Western modernity. For example, in Ethiopia, most of the time we brag that we are not colonized, but most of our theoretical frameworks are post-colonial discourses, which is contradictory. So we should have to see the actual aspect. So recent experience from this series of global crisis, I think, has been giving us a lesson. So today world is rapidly changing, so we should have to, I think, change or not change, but when we discussed yesterday, we have said that we can modify. So modifying is very important because we are living in a changing world. So CR in development policy give us this all lesson. So here is a picture I'm going to show you. Assume that the elephant is Africa, and the people who are surrounding us terrorists, or we can consider it as a theory. So this is the Africa problem. Most of the time, we have been importing a theory instead of contextualizing it in our specific manner, but we try to implement it as it is, and it's going to be failed. So this is all about my presentation. Thank you very much.
Do we have any questions? I see one question at the back from Chad.
My first question is just for all candidates. So at the beginning you set up positivism as the villain, Okay, so you say it's because of positivism that we have a debased understanding of development and what it means. And for you, positivism means objectivity and a certain form of deductive reasoning. Now, what I didn't see in the talk was why that becomes the villain. How does that lead to a faulty understanding of development in Africa?
Would you clarify? I'm not clear with that.
So why is positivism the problem in the first place?
I'm not saying that positivism is solely a problem for economic discourse, but there are realities that are not still addressed. But when we see the positivist school of thought is more of deductivist, is more of a Popperian, which means falsification or other thing need to be there. So what I'm saying that is positivism is in fact is important, but there are realities that are not addressed or approached by others or by the positivist school of thought. So what we need is, I think, multitude of theories. And we are not confined ourselves in terms of one theory or the positivist paradigm, but let's bring alternative theories that can understand the reality. I think someone in the earlier presentation said that science is all about getting closer to the reality. So that's what I want to say in my discussion.
Thanks. Another question here? Okay.
Yeah, thanks very much. I have really two questions for you. When you talked about emergence, you talked about the components that would appear and so forth. But for me, emergence is really the property of interaction of the different parts. An emergent property is something that you see up here, but you wouldn't get from looking at the individual bits.
Yeah.
So emergent things I think of more as being phenomena that appear at the aggregate level because of the interaction between the things between at the bottom. And my other question was, what about the influence of an external power which has a clear idea where they want to go, like China, not necessarily trying to take things over, but having a strong influence on the infrastructure and so forth, and therefore, in some sense, transforming the economic landscape. So how would you see China, for example, as fitting in as opposed to the old colonial influences?
Okay, let me respond to this, particularly for the Chinese presence in Africa. In fact, the Chinese do have a strong influence in Africa. I think recently, I don't know whether you heard any news about Uganda. I think the Uganda, in their education system, they try to adopt Chinese as a part of their educational language. So that is true. The Chinese are become an emerging entities, especially in terms of African context. That's what in my discussion. That's why I am saying that development aspect or development in the forms of policy has been failed because we are still not understanding such kind of sphere of influence. So what we are, I think, need is understanding such kind of influence, then come up with an alternative idea which can liberate Africa. Which can liberate Africa in this context. This is what I understand regarding the Chinese. About emergent, you are correct. I don't know if I made a mistake or not, but you are really right. So I accept that as it is.
Okay, last two questions. I think Andreas and then Sam.
I think it's a very interesting approach. And the entrance was in a way that I felt almost appalled. Because the point you made was it's an ideological problem the West is imposing their influence on us, and we must get rid of that. This implies that Western researchers have an interest in colonizing Africa. Well, there is a political and an economic and business interest in exploiting Africa. It's Chinese, it's Russian, it's Western, it's German, it's US. So, and it's always my problem with critical realist papers and talks. They always start with this ideological notion. And I would strongly recommend to just get rid of that and just make the point we have a misunderstanding of Africa. The traditional views of economists and other social scientists don't work, so let's propose a new one. Then I'm fully with you. Here you leave me, and it took me a while to get back because I thought, oh, it's more interesting than I thought. So you fight an uphill battle where you just don't need to. So leave away all this ideological stuff, leave away the business interests. They are there. That's political economy. That can be explained can be very well explained by Virginia School and others. Just think about the methodological problems you have identified. And then I think your talk is really interesting.
So it's, I think, a kind of comment.
Yes.
May I follow up on that? Or?
Can we go to Sam, and then can we save your comment for
Yeah,
afterwards?
no.
Okay, thanks, Sam.
I really like I like Bhaskar a lot, so I'm sort of on your side, as it were. But I suppose I'm still not quite clear whether you're simply advocating this as a means for a more sort of materialist philosophical grounding for our work, which that's good, that seems fine. But the connection then with the African development questions is still not clear to me, which is perhaps the same point that just been made, as to, you know, we have a vast variety of African developmental questions to address. We presumably need quite a lot of different methodologies to address them. So we need a materialist grounding, I think, in terms of how we understand the world. But there seem to be several other stages that are necessary as well. That's my comment. What you say?
Here, I'm not saying that critical realism is a means, but it can be an alternative framework to see the Africa development or underdevelopment. That's what I tried to discuss in this point. So, for me, the critical realist perspective, especially the ontological aspect, give us a room for understanding about reality that are really unobservable in our day-to-day interaction. For example, if you see the Bantu philosophy, for example, or others, African philosophy, there are multiple casualities that cause events. For example, they call, for example, there are two causes, the physical cause and the spiritual cause. So when you come to the dogmatic or the strict positivist paradigm, it cannot try to accommodate such kind of multitude causality. So that's what I try to discuss in this paper. By the way, this is a draft paper. It's not yet finished, but I tried to elaborate some issues what are important, but most of the time I'm expecting a comment from like you. That's the mechanism I'm trying to implement. Thank you.
Thank you, Kazir. I see there are some disappointed people, so I think you'll have some questions at the end of the session.
Okay.
So, but if we can have Jerome next, please.
I want to talk about a research project, and I wanted to talk after Fischer because I thought maybe some of this speaks to what he has brought up. It's a project we started a couple of years ago with some colleagues in Zimbabwe and Nigeria. I'll tell you about it, but I want to start with the discussions that took place about 20 years ago starting in Europe and then spreading to the world about changing the economics curriculum, because I think that's what we also here for. The title of the symposium was Doing a Better Economics, and as you will recall, there was a call that was published in Le Monde, one of the major newspapers in Paris, in France, but the call was in universities in Paris and then all over France, calling for a better economics. Outside of abstract models, more empirical, getting back history of economic thought and economic history that were progressively abandoned. And this was enthusiastically espoused by many other students, first in Cambridge, in Kansas, but this was really an international congregation, and in Harvard in 2003, and it gave way to a couple of movements. One was that sprang directly out of the Paris movement was the post-statistics economics movement, which later created a review. So they faced some criticism for the name because it took up autistic, saying this was, what's the term, the ableist or something against people with a disability. So they changed the name to Real World Economics Review eventually. But really what it was about was that economics is autistic. It doesn't really listen to the real world. So that's really what we've been discussing much here in the last 2 days. And other movements like Rethinking Economics came, and Plurale Ökonomie in Germany, and that big think tank INET, YSI. I wanted to say something about that because actually much of this talk about ontology and epistemology is quite difficult for me to get around. So a couple of years ago, Melissa and I were involved in the creation of some working groups with INET YSI, and we were discussing whether history of economic thought and philosophy of economics should be the same working group, and I was saying yes because we're all doing the same thing, and Melissa was saying maybe not, and I think I agree with Melissa now. It's not quite the same thing. But in South Africa, more recently, there was also calls for curriculum reform in economics, and they were strongly associated with the fees must fall and roads must fall movement. Out of it sprang notably something that's been held every September, the Rethinking Economics for Africa. They hold a festival where they're inviting critical economists. But really, the movement is more associated with something we've been discussing during the lunch break, the idea of decolonizing the curriculum. And I want to say that these things are related, and my project is kind of showing this and bringing these two strands together. So I want to say a few words about that, because what the European colonization of the world was really for the past 5 centuries or so, it was of course control of territory, but it was also control of minds. And Steve Biko is famous for having developed that theme, how apartheid was a colonization of the minds of black people also, and white people who died at the hands of the apartheid police. But really apartheid, when white people come to South Africa nowadays, or even 10 or 20 years ago, they're often shocked by this situation where this a group of white people, like here, mostly white people, and then all the the staff that serve them at restaurants and clean up are all black people, and they seem to think that's very exceptional, but really apartheid was obviously a part of world history that was a culmination of the European colonization of Africa. So we're all part of this history in Europe as well. It's not something specifically South African. And of course, one central aspect was the dehumanization of the non-white races. And I want to bring up here a quote of David Hume, one of the major Enlightenment philosophers. This is a footnote he put on an essay of National Characters, one of his earlier essays. The footnote was added later, and it says here, I'm going to read it in part, I'm apt to suspect the Negroes and in general all the other species of men, for there are 4 or 5 different kinds, to be naturally inferior to the whites. There never was a civilized nation of any other complexion than white, nor even any individual eminent either in action or speculation, no ingenious manufactures amongst them, no arts, no science. And he says then, well, you know, even the brutes among the whites have some eminent quality. And he said such a uniform and constant difference could not happen in so many countries and ages if nature had not made an original distinction between these breeds of men. And he's then even mentioning some blacks that seem to have been educated, but they're actually more like parrots, just speaking other people's words. And this is really, you know, symptomatic of a whole philosophical movement, because Enlightenment, of course, was all about justice and progress and equality, but it was happening at the same time as slavery and other forms of domination. And there was also in the Enlightenment the brains of what later became scientific racism. You know, Linnaeus, when he classified man as one of the primates, he also distinguished between 4 varieties of humans, you know, the European, the African, the Asian, and the American, the white, black, red, and yellow, which then became the racial categories of the 19th and 20th century. And he ascribed some specific personal traits to them. You know, the blacks are lazy, and the whites are ingenious, and the yellows are wicked, etc. So it's really, you know, during that 18th century period already that these seeds were sown. And I'm going to return to that quote by Hume a bit later. But one of the manifestations of this kind of worldview is something in the history of thought. One of the major treatises of the history of economic thought is the one by Joseph Schumpeter. You know, major 1,300 words book that's referred to by historians of economics to this day. And he assumed that there was actually nothing worthy in economic thinking that had been developed between ancient Greece and Thomas Aquinas. You know, I'm not going to speak about this a lot, but it's just one of these things where he's totally neglecting the contribution of notably Islamic learned scholars of the Middle Ages, which was obviously then the principal center of learning in the world. Counter this, an interesting observation by the German, Swiss, actually social scientist, I should say, or philosopher Karl Jaspers on the origins of history, where he developed this idea of the axial period, basically a period between the 8th and 2nd centuries before Christ. And he was just observing that during that period, there was a lot of thinkers in different regions of the world, notably China, India, and Europe, that developed very similar ideas. And all these thinkers that I put here, so Guanzong in China, same century as Hesiod in Greece, Mencius and Hongzhu in China, again, you know, 4th century, 3rd century before Christ, same period with Xenophon, Plato, and Aristotle, who gave us the first, or so it is claimed, economic ideas, and Kautilya in India. All of them developed ideas about division of labor, markets, market prices, value in exchange, value in use, things that are still part of the economics canon to this day, or at least were so in classical economics. Yes. Okay, I'm not going to be as fast as I promised, but I'll try to wrap up in the next 5 minutes. This was all introduction, of course, but there is then the Islamic Golden Age that I mentioned, so which kind of disproves Schumpeter's great gap. Maybe not Ibn Khaldun was one of the major economic thinkers of the Islamic period, and he developed many themes quite as elaborately as Adam Smith, and quite similar, again, you know, division of labor, extent of the market, exchange, etc. But there's other earlier ones like Al-Ghazali and Al-Tunsi. So what about Africa then? And I'm returning here to Hume because Hume actually revised his footnote and you know, put out all the other 5 different kinds, or 4 different kinds. These were actually the ones theorized by Linnaeus and Blumenbach and others. And he made it more specifically about Negroes, that they you know, are inferior to whites and there was never a Negro civilization. Now Adam Smith, Hume's close friend, had a very different explanation for there not being a coincidence of Africa being underdeveloped. He thought it is because there's no large rivers in Africa and no inland seas. So civilization depends on division of labor, which depends on the extent of the market, which is largely determined by navigable rivers because, water carriage is so much cheaper than land carriage, and therefore in those regions, not only Africa but also Central Asia and others, where there was no easy navigation, development did not take off. But the thing is, he's saying all the inland parts of Africa seem in all ages of the world to have been in the same barbarous and uncivilized state in which they find them at present. Now, his explanation was more sympathetic and very different from Hume's, not racial determinism, but geographic determinism. But both were wrong, because in the inland parts of Africa, during the Middle Ages, we had the Mali Empire, which for several centuries was one of the wealthiest regions in the world. Now, this is actually compatible in part still with Adam Smith's explanation, because they were so wealthy, because they were controlling the trans-Saharan trade routes. But one of the major towns of the Malian Empire, Timbuktu, you've all seen these pictures probably. This is still there. I mean, this is recent, but that's obviously dating to the 13th century. Was one of the principal centers of learning in the Islamic world, and therefore in the whole world, during the Middle Ages. Now, when we're thinking about African history of thought, we when I tell people that's, I'm interested in that, I have a project, people tell me, well, there's no written sources. In fact, it's estimated that there are about 700,000 old manuscripts dating back to the 12th to 16th century in Timbuktu alone. Most of them are in private collections. That's what they look like. They're all written in Arabic script, but not all of them are in Arabic. Some are in African languages. And actually, you might recall a couple of years ago, Al-Qaeda was there and bombing libraries. Actually, a lot of private scholars kept these books and hid them. Sometimes were burying them in the desert. But fortunately, lots of them have also been digitized now by several universities. And then there's, of course, so there is written record, and then there's also the question of orality. In African philosophy, there's a debate whether oral sources should be actually counted as philosophy or not. For me, there's more a question as a historian of thought, whether we can, through oral sources, get at ideas that were formulated in the past, because ideas, when they transmitted orally, have a tendency to change a lot, especially over centuries. So how good a picture does that give us of ancient thought? That's clearly a debate. But to get back to the actual project, so it is a project, as becomes clear here, partly of archaeology also, because it is unearthing some kind of ideas. These 700,000 manuscripts have mostly not been utilized by researchers yet. And it's a matter of, speaking the language, being able to read the script. It's a lot of translation and interpretation. We've held two streams of two conferences that I held with these colleagues in Zimbabwe in 2018, and then in Ibadan in Nigeria in 2019. Then COVID happened, and we wanted to do a conference in 2020 and 2021, but that didn't materialize. So let's see if we manage this year. And I just want to give you a bit of an overview of the different papers that were given at the Zimbabwe conference, to let you see what the history of African economic thought actually could look like. So here, African socialism, this is obviously 20th century thought, but it's still African economic thought. So looking at a Nigerian statesman here, and also in South Africa, someone was working on Achebe, and someone else on a Zambian economist. Further on, Senghor and Kwame Nkrumah. This is obviously things that are written about a lot, also in development thinking, but also more ancient thought. And some colleagues of FISEA actually from Addis Ababa came and spoke about some 19th century and even 16th and 17th century Ethiopian economists and scholars who formulated economic ideas. So, and then of course Ibn Khaldun that I mentioned, that is obviously one of the major economic thinkers of all times, but he also happened to be an African. And here, there's others that exploited also oral sources, I think it's not here, but one of was on Shona, sayings and idioms, and the other one on Igbo idioms, and someone also explored Ubuntu as a concept, which you might encounter in South Africa, meaning humanity. So I just wanted to present this here because it's an ongoing program, and to come back to the question of decolonizing the curriculum, we have to ask what's the cost of that dehumanization of non-white people that has happened over the centuries. And one of the costs is, of course, that we have no ideas what happened in the rest of the world, intellectually speaking. The history of African economic thought or African thought is virtually unknown. Chinese and Indian thought is more known, but also mostly actually studied by people there. And I think there's a great well of ideas that we still have to tap into, and that's what we'll try to do with some seminar series at WITS notably. We call this the history of African economic thought from Tao Tep to Achille Mbembe, and I didn't know I was going to be in the same university as Achille Mbembe a few years down the line, but he actually he also expressed some interest in this understanding. So thank you.
Thanks, Jerome. Can I ask, since you used your questions time, if you could maybe have questions afterwards? Is that okay with you?
Sure. I mean, I think we actually good with time because so the session was meant to go until 4, and we only started 45 minutes late. So we actually still have 20 minutes of the original time of the session. So I'm happy to give you questions, but then.
Okay.
I mean, I think if we knock off at 1:30, it's okay, because then you'll have 1 hour until you then are escorted to your dinner. But I'll let Michael decide.
Okay, should we take one question? Be compromised. We'll take one question.
Now, I went out for 2 minutes, so you may have already said this, but John Stuart Mill participated strongly in this debate, and I think it was on a thing called the Negro Question in 1850 or so, where he argued that there's a vulgar, I'll read it to you, the vulgar error of imputing every difference which he finds amongst human beings to an original difference of nature. And he says, no, this is not true, because everyone is influenced by their environment, by everything else. And so this notion that we can categorize people simply by their race or something is simply wrong. And that seems to be a little bit in contrast with the quotes you had from the post-Enlightenment people. Am I right? Am I wrong?
Probably right. I don't know about what Mill said, but I mean, this was an ongoing debate from the 15th century to the 20th century of human differences. Are people different in kind or not? Voltaire thought we have different species of different. There was this whole debate of polygenesis, or we're all the same people, or actually the different races were created differently. And some of these are racist by today's standards, others are not necessarily. Like Linnaeus, I said, he had formulated these races and ascribed some behavioral traits to them, and still he was a universalist thinker who thought that everyone should be treated the same. And Hume and Kant and Voltaire were staunch critics of slavery, but they still were very racist in their ideas about black people. So that's a very complex question, I think. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Please can we carry on and just complete this session, just in case people need to rush off. And please, I think we've had a lot of food for thought, and it would be really nice to continue this in a lot more detail, possibly over a meal and a good glass of wine or something. But thank you very much. Our final speaker was supposed to be Uskali Maki, and he sent a beautiful email to Michael. Dear Michael, I too am sad about not being there. I was looking forward to it for many reasons, including old connections with Joburg academia and a deepening interest in Carl Mittermeier's thinking. Indeed, as I went on reading him, there was a growing wish to talk with him and ask questions, raise issues, and suggest ways ahead. Your symposium will be a substitute for this, enabling talking about him with others. As I think I mentioned to Chad, I have learned that I have met Carl Mottemeier at least once in Cambridge in 1994. And I think that's such a beautiful message from someone who desperately wants to be here with us today, but couldn't for unforeseen circumstances.
Who's coming back here?
Yes. So thank you very much. And I think this brings us to the end of a very special 2 days. And I'd just like to extend everyone else's thanks as well to Michael and to Mrs. Mottemeier for having us together. I think we've brought together a lot of food for thought, possibly slightly for the bellies than when we started with because of the beautiful location. So thank you very much. We've really appreciated learning more about Carl Mottemeier's ideas, but also about him as a person and a teacher. So thank you.
Oh wow, it's a good thing we're going to the cradle of humankind tomorrow. We're dispelling all those notions of human. Thanks for the work of Wits University researchers in that anthropology department and all those people of the past at Wits. Well, a few housekeeping points. Dinner, okay, I've sent, well, all the guests who are at Dormy House, you will be picked up at 6:30. No, Amos, wrong. Was it Pascal? Wrong. 5:30.
5:30.
Didn't you tell me 5:30?
You talk about dinner or
We're talking about dinner.
Yes, I know. What time?
Okay, we want to be there. We want to be there at 6 o'clock.
where?
At the dinner place.
Yeah.
It is 5 minutes or 10 minutes from here. It's called the Kersner. The Waterford at the Kersner. It's a university, part of the university hospitality school. Everybody, okay, so those who are not staying at the Dormy House, I've sent you a WhatsApp location pin, so that will get you there. Be there 6 o'clock latest, if you can.
So we are at 5:30.
Is there parking there?
There's park. I've never been there. There's parking there.
Is there any place?
There is
Okay.
parking.
There's parking there.
Okay, well, it'll still be lunch when we get there.
That's what we wanted. Apparently we're going to see it during daylight, so we want to see it during daylight for a moment, and then it gets dark. Tomorrow, Cradle of Humankind. So, the tour starts at 9 o'clock, which means you will be picked up at the Dormy House at 7:30. I've got good news to go with that. If you miss breakfast because you couldn't get yourself out of bed early enough, no sweat. There will be food on the bus, so you can catch up. I don't know about the coffee, but maybe there won't be coffee.
Fruit juice, water, and bread rolls.
There you go. Okay. It will then also cater for lunch.
Well, it's meant to be for lunch, but if they oversleep, there's enough for breakfast as well.
Okay. 2 for the price of 1. How's that? That's economical. Well, we've got to be back early enough, and the tour starts, our tour starts at 9 o'clock. If we are later, we're going to be too late for the return trip, because we want to be here on time, so that the transport for 3 of our speakers can take you to the airport. There are questions surrounding that. I haven't got the schedule and the trips and arrangement in front of my eyes, but hopefully tomorrow on the way or at the Cradle of Humankind, I can give you all the details. Not tomorrow, ideally today at dinner time. Uskali sent indeed a very nice note there. It's a treasure trove. The people who are here, it's an absolute treasure trove. It's just phenomenal. I mean, I'm just stunned. And it's a pity that it's only happening now. Carl was very, in the 1980s at WITS, it was a very active place. There were many people we could engage with, economists. We had friends there, daily discussions. Carl was called Mitternächter because he liked to, he stayed up very late. Mitternächter means midnighter. But there were, not at that time, but throughout the day there were people that you would engage with and talk to, and everybody had a great admiration for him. A long list of people that were really friends with him. Kiki Proselenis, of course, right at the beginning. Joseph Labia, Michael Cohen, Dan Leach, Fuad Kassim, Jochen Rundi, Ludwig Lachmann, Chris Thor, Peter Lewin, Mario Sherry, and many others. Things changed radically in the 1990s, as it happens in economics departments throughout the world. And so there was, all of these people I mentioned, apart from Kiki and myself, left the university or left the university environment. And so the 1990s were a period of isolation. I wish he could have met with each one of you. I really wish. That's the treasure trove. I think you would have found so many stimulating discussions. And I think, this was before the internet, the real onset of internet and communication and everything digital. It wasn't to be, but at least we can provide some of Carl's work to the rest of the world as this symposium. I got to know Schmoller's Jahrbuch. We talked about Schmoller. And Schmoller had the Schmoller's Yearbook. It changed names a number of times. And it's been resuscitated over the past sort of 6 years to be more what it was right at the beginning. And it's been resuscitated along those lines by Niels Goldschmidt, who's one of the co-editors of the journal. And it's no longer called Schmoller's Jahrbuch, and it doesn't just come once a year, it comes more often a year. Here's the announcement. We're going to have a special issue in the Journal of Contextual Economics. And so I really hope that you're all willing to provide, Fish talked about drafts, he's only just had a draft. I think we're all in that position. We all just have drafts of various completion. And so I hope you will be willing to make your contribution available so that we can include it in Schmoller's Jahrbuch. Thank you very much for that, Niels. And then I want Kiki quickly to come to the front.
You don't know everything. Isabella, they talk about Africa and Ubuntu. Ubuntu, you know what that means? Well, I think you, the best representative of Ubuntu. I want to introduce myself just as a friend of late Carl and Isabella. Isabella knew my husband, I knew Carl, but neither of us knew each other. And my husband said, we've got to reciprocate Isabella's hospitality, so shall we invite them to lunch? That was in the early 70s, and as I opened the door, I didn't know Isabella, but I knew Carl. And I said, Carl, what are you doing here? And that's how our friendship became never ending with my late husband, Lambro, late Carl, Isabella, and myself. And I hope you'll all be blessed with such beautiful friendships. That has been a very, very big blessing in my life. And I was honored to be here with you all today. I was taken back to my student days when we had apartheid and we couldn't have these marvelous speakers. And today, many of you fulfilled a wish I had in the 1960s to hear people of your caliber lecturing me. But I was more fortunate, I think, than most, because I had Professor Lachman in person. From being wanting to do law, I became an economist because of Professor Lachman. And knowing Carl in person. And Carl wasn't only this academic you were talking about. Carl was a different man. Carl was a man who played tennis on Friday afternoons. Carl was a man that told me when I fell pregnant, Kiki, have you worked out how much it's going to cost you to have a baby? That is the most beloved Carl. And I think before we go further, in Greek tradition, in Greek religious tradition, I would like us all just to have a minute's silence for Carl. Thank you. Isabella, now the party begins. I think the party begins. Would you like to come forward?
No, I'm not speaking.
You have to come.
No, I never say anything.
I'm not Carl. Come.
No, no.
No, you're not going to say nothing, I promise you.
What am I going to do?
You've done so much for Carl and you're shy to come up. Come. We owe all this to you.
No, you don't.
And we want to say
if there
thank
wasn't
you.
the goods, I couldn't do it.
Well, if you don't come to the mountain, then I'll come to the mountain. Isabella, this is from all of us here.
Oh, that's very
To say a
Thank
wonderful
you very much indeed.
and deep-hearted thank you for
Thank
who
you.
you are and what you're doing
This is
for your
beautiful.
husband, Carl.
Thank you very much indeed.
Enjoy, Isabella.
Thank you.
There we go.